Okay, looks like we're live. Hello.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Gregory Joseph, and I am the program director with NCADP, the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. This is our monthly webinar series. Today's topic is lethal injection and medical ethics. I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Groner, who's a pediatric surgeon and professor at The Ohio State University, and Lauren Knapp, who's a documentary filmmaker and professor at Georgetown University and Northwestern. Today's conversation is going to be really outstanding. We hope that you participate. There is a chat feature on the side of your screen where you can enter questions where both the moderator and the panelists will be able to discuss your questions in detail. But first, before we start, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. As you may know, we've been around for 25 years. The National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty has been building the U.S. movement against the death penalty since 1976. And it's only because of the people like you who are out there fighting the death penalty day to day that make us and all our state affiliates possible. So throughout this entire exercise, we hope that you would feel free to encourage NCADP, donate to NCADP, share our information, and really try to enlist more people into the fight against the death penalty. As you know, our goals here at the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty are multifaceted. We have been developing nationwide effective strategies fighting the death penalty. We have built advocates across the state. We've launched state-based affiliates who are out there fighting on their local strategies and independently against the death penalty across the United States. Here's a little context on how far we've come. In 1976, only 8 states have abolished the death penalty. But thanks to our efforts and the efforts of people like you and across the country, we now have 20 states, including the District of Columbia, that have abolished the death penalty. NCADP works with 2 main programs. Our first program is litigation. We provide technical assistance to help the capital defense programs and teams across the country so they can help provide the litigation that we need to abolish the death penalty. This approach helps us save lives. It keeps the possibilities of rehabilitation and redemption open for death prisoners. It also prevents the possibility of innocent people being executed. And we hope that through these efforts and the education efforts that our litigation team provide, that one day the Supreme Court will take up the death penalty and abolish it for all. Again, our litigation support is very important to capital defense teams across the country, and any contributions or donations or sharing of our information that you can make on behalf will help us be able to keep this important program moving. Our second program is called Justice Powered by Information and Action, JPIA. And what it serves to do is educate a broad-based coalition of people about the death penalty. We currently have in this country 45% of people who are opposed to the death penalty, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we like to educate people on the totality of what the problems of the death penalty are: the racial bias, the cost incurred, the fact that it's not a deterrent to crime, and the fact there are actually proven effective strategies out there that go on to help actually cause and rectify the roots of crime that are actually effective and proven to be successful. The JPIA program is also centered with these webinars. Since over the past year, we've been doing webinars on a wide range of issues, really approaching the death penalty from a multifaceted approach, whether it's been the Supreme Court abolition, what the Supreme Court means to the abolition movement, to mental illness and the death penalty, to film screenings like in The Execution of a Shadow, or even today's with lethal injection and medical ethics. We're trying to provide our base and to a larger extent the entire American public with a full understanding of what the death penalty is and how they can get involved in the abolition of the death penalty. But the only way that we can do these webinars, obviously, is by the help of people who are like you. So if you want to be able to continue these webinar series, we do them monthly. Please feel free to go to our website at ncadp.org/donate and make a contribution, or just simply share our information on your social media devices. Now, at the end of this webinar, we'll be asking you to take some sort of an action. Today's action is going to be on behalf of a death row prisoner in Tennessee. We're going to be asking people to call the governor and ask for a stay of the execution for a gentleman by the name of Edmund Jargowski. who had a temporary stay issued last month, but now has a new execution date on November 1st of this year. And we are asking people to stand up and use their voice and ask the governor of Tennessee to postpone this execution. So after the event, after the webinar, please stick around for a little bit, and I'll give you some more information on how you can get involved in our take action, and also how you can help further spread the word of JPIA. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Knapp and Dr. Jonathan Groner.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me and letting me share the Sandman with everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and this is an important discussion that I'm really happy to take a part in.
Hi, it's John Groner. Thanks for inviting me to be on the webinar, and I look forward to seeing the video again and talking about it afterwards.
So I'm going to go ahead and start with the documentary. This is a shortened version of an already short documentary. I cut out a few minutes in the middle here just to make the time a little bit quicker, but I think you'll get a good sense of the film. This is profiling a doctor in Georgia who at the time was the head of the lethal injection team for the state, and it deals with issues surrounding medical ethics, questions about responsibility, and the idea of lethal injection as kind of a more humane form of execution. So I'll go ahead and play the video, and then we will have a Q&A afterward. There you go. All right, I had to show the credits to make sure everyone who helped me out with that were recognized. So I want to start this Q&A out. First of all, if you have any questions out there that you want to throw in, please go ahead and type them in, and we will try to get to them. And after about a 15-minute Q&A, we'll have some time to respond more directly. So first of all, I wanted to ask Dr. Groner, excuse me, if you could tell me a little bit about your role in researching lethal injection and how you got involved in it.
Sure. First, I have no role in executions. I should be clear about that. I got involved in capital punishment sort of accidentally. A long time ago when I was first in practice, I took care of a child whose father had murdered his mother and one other child, and this child came to the hospital with injuries, and as a result of that, I ended up testifying in the capital murder trial of the person's father, who was convicted and sent to death row, and that sort of sparked my interest. I mean, at that time, that was when lethal injection was just on the rise, so hearing about that, this individual was convicted, which didn't surprise me. He ultimately ended up dying of medical condition. He died of cancer in the prison before he was executed. But that sort of got me interested in it, and then delving into lethal injection was kind of a weird thing just because having studied Holocaust in high school, there's certain analogies that we could get into if you want, but basically before the concentration camps got going full speed, there was a move to sort of get rid of a lot of Germany's deformed children by executing them largely by lethal injection, and I take care of injured children and children with disabilities as part of my career, so obviously I saw something in that.
Yeah, and I should mention part of what led me to making The Sandman. I was struck by the Glossop v. Gross Supreme Court case that was decided in June of 2015. And in that case, several inmates in Oklahoma who were on death row were contending the use of midazolam in their scheduled executions. Midazolam is a drug that has not been approved by the FDA as an anesthetic. And Dr. Groner, I'm sure you can speak more fully to the use of midazolam than I can, but it had been used in a couple of botched executions. And the Supreme Court essentially said that a constitutionally adequate method of execution does not need to meet the standard of medical care. And in reading that case and that decision, I just found a lot of interesting contradictions between the use of medicine and using drugs in an execution, and became just very curious about like what that contradiction means for us and the people that kind of work within that space. So moving forward, I'm wondering quickly if you can just tell us a little bit about the historic role of doctors in executions in terms of recording deaths, death records and such.
So, I mean, over the long arc of capital punishment history in the United States, doctors were present for the first electric chair execution. In fact, electrocution is actually a made-up word. It's a contraction of electricity and execution. So people say when they, had some sort of shock from when they were working on wires, they got electrocuted. That's not true. Electrocution refers specifically to judicial killing by electricity. Several doctors were present at that execution. It actually, although a fair amount of research went into it, it was much more than lethal injection, by the way. It was actually completely botched. As lethal injection moved forward, many medical professional organizations became more and more specific about what constituted participating. I mean, the American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, the National Society of Emergency Medical Technicians all have very strong and specific prohibitions about participating in capital punishment. The Nurses Association is quite a bit stronger than the medical associations, interestingly. And I think sort of from an overall philosophical, ethical perspective, I've always felt strongly that that's when doctors have sort of crossed that line, when they have used their medical skills to cause harm, it's generally worked out bad for them and bad for society. And I could certainly talk about that a little bit more, but I think that in my own practice, I operate on people's children, sometimes newborn children. And I think that often I've just met their families before the operation because of an emergency. And I think that trust between the public and the medical community is based on the assumption that we will never use our powers, and I have quite a bit of power actually, for harm. So, and I think that's really important. And when that line is crossed, again, I think it generally works out badly for all of us.
Right. Well, and people, and that's why we have medical boards. We have because people put a lot of respect in that white coat and in that title in the front of your name, and so when you cross the line with that, it definitely has ramifications. But it also strikes me that you can use that power as a way of legitimizing something that a practice that is not in fact a medical practice, as we can see here.
Right. So I mean, this and I wrote a paper about this sort of this veneer of medical respectability can allow you to. I mean, there can be sort of like if you're wearing a white coat, it's sort of like normalized deviance. I mean, it is a fact that doctors supervised torture of prisoners in Guantanamo just to make sure they didn't go too far, but the presence of doctors in that situation allowed that to progress. And I think the same is true for capital punishment. I mean, I know from being involved in litigation that the actual gurney that they use in Georgia to strap the inmate down to execute him is the same one we have in our emergency room here. We just don't have the leather restraints because most of our patients are not expected to resist. It's the exact same one. Much of the IV equipment we use is the same. So the procedures become extremely medicalized.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to make sure we talked about was this line that Dr. Musa says at the very beginning of the film: instead of a carcinoma, it's a court order. And this is something he said to me several times in interviews, and I think he's written this line as well. It's something that he's thought about a lot and really kind of is ingrained in his own personal philosophy about why he does what he does. And I'm wondering what you took from that statement, Dr. Groner.
I think that was one of the most striking statements in the documentary. And of course, I disagree with it. I mean, I don't mean him disrespect, but I find disagree in a fairly fundamental way. I mean, in my mind, I sort of think about what happens after the execution. So, I mean, Georgia is either coroner or medical examiner state. Someone has to sign the death certificate, And there's 5 things that a coroner can sign a death certificate. They can sign it as a homicide, a suicide, an accident, natural, or undetermined. Someone dies of cancer, dies a natural death. Someone who dies of a court order dies of a homicide. And I've seen death certificates from legal injections. They are homicides. And I'd also say, in my world, we don't work too much with end-of-life issues, but we work with them some. And I have, experiences with friends and relatives who've died, sometimes of cancer. And when someone's dying of cancer, the fear is basically pain and suffering, and obviously a doctor can help that. So there's a lot of physical pain that they fear. When someone is dying of the court order, it's more sort of the metaphysical pain of knowing the exact date and moment of their demise. So it's totally different. So again, lethal injection is a homicide. Dying of cancer is a natural death, and there's definitely a role for comfort in that. I don't believe there's a role in comforting someone for a homicide. And furthermore, if I can just go on just a little bit, that I'm in a unique position that I've met the only 2 individuals who survived a lethal injection long enough to talk about it. There's a 3rd individual in Oklahoma who survived it when I think the governor intervened but ended up dying of a heart attack. But I met Romel Broom and I met Alva Campbell, who's no longer alive, and neither of them had a doctor present at their execution. I mean, Romel Broom was stuck with IVs 18 times. And then they called for a doctor to try to help, and it wasn't a doctor who was very experienced and couldn't really help. And, when I met him, it seemed like I didn't specifically ask him, but he certainly appeared grateful to be alive, although still somewhat shell-shocked because it was only 4 days after they tried to execute him. And I subsequently met Mr. Campbell, too. So in this situation, the doctor was the agent that caused death, and absent that, these 2 people survived. And again, to go with the cancer analogy, I think patients being treated for cancer are willing to undergo a fair amount of suffering in order to live. And I think if you would ask, obviously it's a thought experiment, I didn't do it, but if you ask Mr. Campbell, would you rather be stuck 18 times for a chance to survive or be stuck once by someone who's good at it and know you're going to die? I think he'd pick the needle torture to survive.
Yeah, I mean, it also, I think, brings to light the idea of lethal injection as this sort of like painless, more humane form of execution. And which, to be honest, when I started researching The Sandman, researching the film, I've been against capital punishment pretty much my entire life, but I'd always kind of assumed if we're gonna have it, we should have lethal injection. It's this painless way of dying. You just kind of drift off to sleep. And recently, that's just not been the case in several different cases. But I also came to a different realization, which is sort of what I hope that the end of the film lingers on, is this idea of having the perception of a more humane way of killing people. Is that actually extending the practice of capital punishment in the U.S. longer than it might otherwise be extended? Are we actually killing more people because the method is perceived to be more humane?
Well, I think it's an excellent point. It's very clear that the rise of capital punishment in the United States tracked closely with the advent of lethal injection. I would push back a little bit on calling it a humane way. I mean, it can be humane or it can be horribly botched. I mean, the track record in Ohio, where I live, is actually quite terrible. There are executions that have taken well over an hour. There's one individual who had to be given a bathroom break during his execution. There's another individual who was a drug abuser who recognized that the drugs weren't going in the right place. So, and again, it's this veneer of medical respectability, but because of IV access, some inmates have obviously been tortured. And because of the drug sequence with the giving the paralytic, anybody who's received a neuromuscular paralytic looks serene. They may or may not be conscious. And I mean, you can go on the web and look at this like Anesthesia Awareness Society. I mean, those things actually do happen. It's extremely, extremely rare, almost unheard of, when your medications are being given by a board certified, anesthesiologist or certified nurse anesthetist. But when basically prison guards who don't really know what they're doing with the drugs give it, I think it's more than likely that some inmates could have been paralyzed and still been awake, and they're not monitored, so you would never know. So again, it's kind of this veneer of medical respectability. We don't know. I mean, the reason muscle relaxants are given in general surgery is really not for the inmate to make him or her comfortable. It's actually more for the surgeon to do stuff in someone's abdomen that requires the muscles to be relaxed. So it's not part of an anesthetic for comfort. It's part of an anesthetic for the surgeon. And a lethal injection is done to paralyze the breathing muscles, but that paralyzes everything. And there's no way for the inmate to actually say something if they're feeling something. So we just don't know.
Right. And I mean, the irony is that probably the quickest, most surefire way of executing someone is through like a much more obviously violent method, like the firing range or the guillotine or something like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's actually very difficult to find reports of botched firing squad executions. The people doing the executions are usually familiar with the method, and usually law enforcement officers or security personnel actually know how to fire guns. I mean, there's pretty good evidence that 4 or 5 bullets fired directly into the heart cause pretty much immediate cessation of consciousness. But it's just ugly. So, and I think, and there's a lot of blood. So I think that that has lost traction in the United States as a country that's somewhat ambivalent about capital punishment.
Yeah. I just want to encourage everyone to please text in or write in any questions that you have. We'll keep talking, but if you do have anything, I'll get to it for sure. One thing that kind of I hint out in the documentary that I think is important to acknowledge is the idea of financial institutions and decision making. In this case, Dr. Musso has created what is now a very large medical organization that provides medical care to prisons throughout 4 different states. When he was just starting his company, that is when he agreed to do the executions, and he himself acknowledges that you have to take the good with the bad in business. You have to do the things that maybe are less pleasant in order to kind of win the good graces of the people you're working for. And Dr. Groner, I'm wondering if you can comment on the role of financial incentives in decision making, and I don't know, maybe if there's a way that you see it also playing out in a less extreme way on a more daily basis.
Well, I mean, you said it really well. Obviously, the pharmaceutical industry has known this forever, and on this smaller scale, I mean, many universities and university-affiliated hospitals have actually stopped doing that. The joke was, when I was a general surgery resident, there's a class of antibiotics called cephalosporins, and we used to with the particular one we were using we used to call it Cephalunch, because that was the antibiotic from the drug rep who'd given us lunch that week. So again, the pharmaceutical industry has long known that small incentives, financial or otherwise, can drive behaviors. I mean, the bigger question is, can financial incentives alter your view of ethics? And, I think the answer is yes. And, I'm reading a book about a, large crime family who, managed, and obviously it's fiction, but there's analogies in the real world to alter their perceptions of, that whatever bootlegging or influencing or bribery or racketeering or perhaps even murder can all be rationalized because the family's living very, very well. And so, I mean, that it does drive that. And these might be called conscious biases or unconscious biases, but when you see this excellent documentary and you see the pan across this very large mansion, and the person's explaining how they have to do a few things to have this contract, because you have to take the bad with the good, it does make you wonder. And in the capital punishment world, there are other examples, lesser known, where people with medical expertise have been paid for executions, basically in cash, to conceal the transaction. So obviously, it has required some financial incentives to keep this whole program going.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure I am clear that I'm not 100% sure of what Dr. Musso's motivations are beyond what he told me, and so I hesitate to speculate. But I do see a complicated situation with the business involvement and doing something that is against what pretty much every medical organization prohibits. So.
I mean, he says. I mean, he's a very thoughtful person. I enjoyed listening to him. I enjoyed listening to what he said. He said he's read all these things that I cited, American Medical Association and so forth, but I disagree with them. And he just sort of leaves it at that. I mean, he didn't really cite a religious context and ethical background. I mean, he did a little bit, but I think that it's interesting that how, his journey to getting that place is interesting and worth examining, which I guess is why you made the video, but why you made the film. So, but I'm not saying like I would just like him or just like talking to him, but he comes to a particular place and a particular point, and that's I think it's interesting discussion. It makes you wonder, what about the doctors who help supervise some of the prisoners in Guantanamo? How did they get to that? Because obviously there probably isn't a financial incentive there, but they're in a military apparatus where there might be rewards for participating.
Yeah, I have a few questions here that are coming in. One from Chris. Do you know if rates of public acceptance of the death penalty is higher in states who require medical professionals to be present? I do not know the statistics. Dr. Groner, do you have any indication about that?
There's no data because, ironically, there's a lot of secrecy surrounding executions. It actually takes a fair amount of work to figure out who is involved. I mean, Ohio has emergency medical technicians by and large, and their secrecy is so well guarded that when they testified about one of these botched executions, they were actually like behind a screen with voice garbling software and so forth. So it's very difficult. You can almost spend a lifetime finding out what's going on in every state, how they get their meds, who's there for the executions, who actually starts the IVs. There's a lot of secrecy, so it's really hard to know. I think, and you can no longer do the experiment of which states versus lethal injection versus not, because 99% of execution are lethal injection. There have been a few electric chair executions in the past 10 years, and I believe that's the only other method that's been used.
Yeah, and I think the secrecy, I clipped that out of it's in the longer version of the documentary. We touch on it. Georgia has one of the more extreme secrecy laws where it's impossible for the public to obtain any information about who's making the drugs, exactly how the drugs are being made, who's involved in the process. Dr. Musso kind of outed himself, but that strikes me as another one of these sort of contradictions when we're using, drugs and which are and the practice of medicine for the opposite of its intended purpose. It leads to this kind of hyper secretive practice, which is like the opposite of the scientific method. It's the opposite of the philosophy of medicine, which is to be experimenting and sharing information.
Right. That's one point. Another interesting point is also that, well, obviously alluded to the fact that I'm not a big fan of the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry realizes that the use of their products and executions is actually bad for them. And I wrote a paper a long time ago where I referred to capital punishment or lethal injection specifically as a stain on the face of medicine. I mean, these companies, we use propofol, which is that white milky substance that Michael Jackson famously used to kill himself, sadly. But we use it hundreds of times a day at this institution where I'm working. And at one point, the company that made it proposed taking it out of the U.S. market because people wanted to use it for execution. So they're aware that killing is bad for their industry. That it's ultimately defiling to the industry. So they worked at great lengths to keep their drugs from being used. Many of the drugs have been bought under subterfuge, under false pretenses. They've tried to go to these intermediary dealers and so forth. And if capital punishment and executions are societal good, why does there have to be so much secrecy and so much subterfuge is an interesting question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get to a couple more questions that are being typed in. Gregory, you asked, are executioners paid with tax-paying dollars? Yes, this is a government process. In the case of Georgia, I believe that the team receives around $30,000, and that is, I think it's dispersed among 6 people, and I'm sorry if my numbers are a little bit off, but Dr. Musso has written and told me that of what he receives from that money, he donates, he uses some to cover legal fees, and then donates the rest to a charity for children. I can not remember the name of the charity off the top of my head. So again, it's difficult to fact check a lot of that because of the secrecy laws, but yes, this is a public procedure.
But Dr. Musso may donate his proceeds from the actual homicides, but he does still derive income from, I mean, he has a contract for all healthcare, and I think that's a worthwhile thing. He is responsible for the healthcare of all inmates in that prison, maybe in that prison system, which is another ethical issue. So, like, would you go see someone to show them, you know, the lump on your neck if that's the person who's going to eventually execute you? I think that's worth pointing out that there's another tremendous ethical dilemma that the person providing you healthcare may also be the person who's going to kill you down the road. So I think that's worth pointing out, and the fact that yes, he donates the execution money, but he still has a large and what appears to be a very lucrative contract to provide health care to this prison.
Right,
and,
exactly.
And there are other states, again, I don't have like my whole volumes and volumes of notebooks. There are other examples in other states where they tried to get medical residents in one state, I think it was Illinois, this is way back, and pay them in cash. And I'm sure that's not, you know, out of a governor's wallet. I'm sure that those are state funds.
Right. Nathan, you asked, how do we cultivate advocacy among physicians to put a halt to physician-assisted lethal injection? I think that's a great question.
Oh, so you're letting me take that one. So, I mean, that's a great question. I've personally gone, so again, I'm in Ohio, the Ohio State Medical Association. It can be very, very difficult. I mean, it's a professional organization. It's supposed to have sort of a responsibility. It's supposed to behave in a moral fashion. I mean, in theory, if we were like a trade organization, and I don't want to like pick on plumbers, but in theory, like a plumbers organization does not have that same responsibility, but it's supposed to be a professional organization. I found it amazingly frustrating. I mean, to go to the state medical organization, I mean, they're willing to discipline doctors if they're dealing drugs to their patients or having inappropriate relationship with their patients, but an overall sort of broader ethical context about not being involved in executions, even though it's right there in the AMA's Code of Medical Ethics, was a much, much harder sell. And I basically got zero traction at this meeting I went to, post-call, driven down to wherever their meeting was. So it was sadly, now that was a few years back, but sadly that was a complete waste of time. I think there are other organizations that may be more progressive. I think, and Dr. Musso talks about this in the film, that trying to call out people who participate, you may or may not agree with the strategy, but certainly from a behavioral economics standpoint, if you made it so unpleasant for someone to do, they're obviously less likely to do it. And again, if it's a societal good, why does it have to be so secret? Why should he be ashamed of it? As far as I'm aware, there's never been a credible threat against a member of the execution team, although they worry about that quite a bit. I mean, I'm just not aware of any case of someone who's been threatened. I mean, based on the news, you'd have more of a threat just by being a Democratic leader than going to do an execution. So I think that that's that's often cited why it has to be secret. We have to protect their security. I'm not personally aware of anybody who's been threatened in any sort of serious way, but I could be in the dark about that.
Just going through and checking a few more. What can we do as a patient? I think, that question, I think that's more of what can you do as a citizen, which is if you, feel strongly that in abolishing capital punishment, that's calling your representatives and making your voice heard. One of the lingering questions that I have with the film, and something I tried carefully to do, is to not put too much blame specifically on Dr. Musso, because I want to be careful not to give him all of the responsibility, although I think he does he should be taking some responsibility. But I think there is a question about when someone is executed, who's at fault? Is it the person who committed the crime? Is it the public who supports the policy and the law? Is it the judge or the jury? Is it the person who actually injects the drugs? And when we focus too much on just one specific cog in that machine, we lose, the picture of the machine. Although if one cog isn't working, then maybe the machine will break down entirely. So I think that, that is an important question, an important reminder that we do have voices as citizens. And if this is something that's important to you, it's important to, make your voice heard.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think a lot about doctors involved in executions from a patient's point of view. I mean, would I want the doctor who was doing lethal injections down in Chillicothe, which is in Ohio, on Monday, being the anesthesiologist putting me to sleep for my GI procedure on Tuesday? And the answer is obviously no. So I think that as citizens and patients, you can lean on medical societies, you can write letters, you can advocate, and I think every letter helps. I think I've been involved in this for a long time, and I feel like there's a pendulum swinging. I think more states have abolished capital punishment. I'm hoping in my lifetime we'll be done with this.
Thank you very much, both Lauren Knapp and Dr. Jonathan Groner, for that very informative and powerful discussion on lethal injection and medical ethics. And speaking of getting involved and writing and using your voice to advocate for the abolishment of the death penalty, I just wanted to once again tell you about our program, Justice Powered by Information in Action, which is the program that brings you these webinars. As you know, these webinars are really designed to give you the knowledge and the tools to help us at NCADP and you build a grassroots movement so we can shift our nation from using evidence-based programs that are proven to address the root causes of crime and increase public safety. We are looking to move toward a system that, instead of justice focused on finding people to punish them and biased against people of color and with mental challenges. And I believe that together that we can mobilize that 45% of US residents who do not support the death penalty and persuade the 55 who yet don't understand exactly how heinous of a crime it is. And unfortunately, right now, we are always in the process of looking for people to help us continue this webinar series. So please feel free to visit our website at www.ncadp.org/donate to find the various tiers in which you can get involved. And if you're unable to contribute yourself, we recommend that we hope that you would actually use Facebook as a possible fundraising vehicle. You can direct people of your network via Facebook to donate to NCADP on special days like your birthday or anniversary, or a special day that falls of a personal nature. And you can find all that information on how to direct a fundraising cause for NCADP at www.facebook.com. And as we always like to get people involved in the cause for the abolition of the death penalty, there is a death row prisoner on Tennessee by the name of Edmund Zoroski. And we're asking people on this webinar to not only call the governor of Tennessee and ask him to stop the execution, but to spread this information to your friends. On the chat screen, you'll see some various links that will provide you some more information about not just Mr. Zoroski's case, but all the pending executions and how you can use your voice to get a call for action. So once again, I'd like to thank Lauren and Dr. Groner for their time and expertise. And our next webinar will be coming to you in the month of November. And please feel free, keep an eye out for the link that we'll be sending all the participants to tell you exactly how you can view this webinar and share it with other people, and the subject and the participants for our next webinar and our upcoming action in support of the film In the Execution of Shadow. Until next month, my name is Gregory Joseph for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. On behalf of Lauren Knapp and Dr. Jonathan Groner, please make your voice heard and get out there and stop the death penalty. Until next month, peace, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to Thanks a lot.